All right, hello, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, coming to you through Zoom yet again to talk about bulbs for the home landscape. Interesting topic. Certainly a great way that we can have some really wonderful flowers that really add a lot of color and a lot of interest to our landscape. So, I want to start off just talking about what a bulb is. A bulb is kind of often used to refer to a wide range of different plants that all have some form of underground fleshy storage structure. And in any of these instances, that underground storage structure is there to be a reserve of nutrients that will help ensure that that plant survives over a period of time when it doesn't have foliage up, when environmental conditions might not be good for its growth. Now, we often talk about bulbs, and really only some of the plants that we refer to as having bulbs have what we would really consider a true bulb. So again, where we think about that, a bulb is any plant that's going to store its complete life cycle in that underground storage structure. And it's important. A true bulb really is a miniature plant. So again, that definition is any plant storing its complete life cycle in that underground storage structure. You can see an image of that over on the right of your screen. And you can see if you cut that bulb in two, then when you do that, you can actually see all of those structures there as a part of that plant. So you can see the basal plate down at the bottom. That would be where those roots are coming out of. The fleshy scales of that bulb, which are really modified leaves that are there to store a lot of that energy. Around that is what we call the tunic or the tunica, which is that papery shell on the outside of that bulb, which is really made up of old leaves. And then, of course, we're going to have the shoot. Even when the bulb is small, we can see that shoot down in the center of the bulb if we look really closely. And then we may have lateral bulbs coming off of that that we would refer to as an offset or a booble or a bulbul, however we want to pronounce that, which we would then separate off if we're dividing our bulbs, like we discussed during our plant propagation talk. So when we talk about true bulbs, there is some diversity there as well. We have the tunicate bulbs and what we call imbricate bulbs. A tunicate bulb is really what we think of, things like tulips and daffodils and hyacinths, and then also, of course, things like an onion. And onions being what I normally think of as my example to use when I'm talking about bulbs. And they have that papery covering or tunic that's there to protect those scales from drying out, maybe protect that bulb a little bit from mechanical injury. And now some of our bulbs are not going to have that tunic layer. They don't have that papery shell that's going to help protect them. So plants like lilies or fritillaria are imbricate bulbs. And it's really important that we know that because we do need to make sure that we keep those protected, particularly keep them moist, because we don't want those scales drying out. Now, when we are talking about bulbs, oftentimes we're really talking about all sorts of different plants that have different kinds of storage organs that they keep. Corms being really common, along with tubers and rhizomes. And a corm is very similar in appearance to a bulb, but if you cut one in two, you can see that you're not going to have all of those layers of bulb there. You just have one solid mass. You can see kind of a cross-section image there of that just being one solid mass. Of course, you still have that basal plate. You still have that tunic covering. And very often, in terms of how we deal with them, they're going to be very similar to the true bulbs. They even produce cormlets, which we would kind of treat just the same way as we're dividing them. Tubers are really quite different, and of course, using the potato as an example there, you can divide those up into all of the different, with all of the eyes, and allow those to root and to send up shoots. But again, really solid. Now, rhizome, very different, sort of a stem or root that goes right underneath that ground, and is really a root structure that we can divide up as long as we have a shoot and a root on it. But today, we're not going to focus too hard on whether the particular plant we're interested in is a bulb or a quorum or tuber or rhizome. We're just going to talk a little bit about how they're planted, and some suggest some really good flower types for Mississippi gardens. Now, when we are planting bulbs, generally speaking, we want to plant those about 2.5 times deeper than the diameter of that bulb. So the distance from one side of the bulb to the other would be the diameter, and that just gives us a kind of a good indication of about how deep we need to put them. If we're going to be planting them individually, we can do things the old way. Up there in the top left is a bulb planter. It's really just a ring of metal that we can put down into the ground to remove a core of soil, to set that bulb down. Oftentimes they have a little measurement ruler on one side that helps us make sure that we're getting the depth right. So really convenient to use. If we're just planting a very small number of bulbs, that's great. If you're planting a larger number of bulbs, that can turn into a fairly intensive bit of work. Of course, you can get a drill attachment that will dig a little hole for you, essentially a small auger that you can use to dig holes. I find those to be very useful and certainly a lot quicker than using a traditional bulb planter. If you get a long attachment, particularly attractive is you can use it standing up and not have to hurt your knees, sitting down on the ground that way. Sometimes you're going to have bulbs that do have roots attached, and when you want to do that, we want to have kind of a little ridge of soil in the center, spread the roots downward just to allow them to spread out. If it doesn't have roots, you can just have a wide-based hole, set that bulb just securely on the soil, and cover it over. Now, if we're going to be planting a large number of bulbs, you can see the image down there at the bottom, all of those bulbs all laid out. I certainly would not want to dig an individual hole for every single one of those. So if you're going to have a large area planting, it's relatively a good idea, dig a trench, and then space out the bulbs and then cover them over as a much easier task than digging individual holes for each single bulb. Now, just like when we're planting anything, it is very important that after we get those bulbs in the ground, we thoroughly water them in, make sure we're giving them a good contact between the bulb and the soil, providing them enough moisture to start the root growth, start allowing them to take in nutrients for the soil, that's going to turn into the wonderful flower that we're waiting on. One thing we can do with bulbs, we don't want all of our flowers to show up all at once and then all go away at once, sort of leaving a bare spot in our landscape. So we can kind of extend the period over which they bloom by planting them at slightly different depths. Plant some a little deeper, some a little shallower. And that's going to just extend the amount of time that we see those bulbs coming up. Another thing to keep in mind with that is that the location of the bulbs will also matter. So varying how much sun or shade those bulbs are planted in can lead to variation in the time of their blooming by as much as about 2 weeks. So when we want to plant bulbs is going to be dependent on where we are. Generally, our spring flowering bulbs are going to be put in when the soil temperature is about 40 to 45 degrees. Here in Mississippi, oftentimes we're seeing that in December, though it's going to vary again just a little bit by where you happen to be located. That root growth is going to start within that temperature, but it's not going to start the growth of that foliage. So that gives that bulb plenty of time to really get that root growth in there and get all the energy and all the resources it needs, or all the nutrients and resources it needs in order to put up that flower. Our summer flowering bulbs, we're going to be putting in the spring. Generally, we want to wait till after our final frost date. We don't want to put bulbs in the ground and then have another really good strong cold snap. Again, that's going to be different in accordance with where you are, because the difference in final frost date for southern Mississippi, where I am, can be several weeks different than northern areas of the state. Again, when we're talking about planting bulbs, if we think back to talking about division, and if we want to multiply those bulbs, sometimes we do plant them a little shallower. More shallow planting of our bulbs will lead to the formation of offsets that we can then later use to expand some of the area that we have in our landscape where we're using these flowers. Just like with anything, it is important that we make sure that we have good fertilization for the plants we have in our landscape. And while certainly, generally, I follow the don't guess soil test method for fertilization. Generally speaking, what we want for bulbs is a pH range really between 5.5 and 6.5 up to 7. They do use a lot of phosphorus, so often we will be supplementing phosphorus into the soil when we're planting. And you will find a variety of different bulb-specific fertilizers out there. Generally speaking, these are going to have a lower amount of nitrogen and then more in terms of the phosphorus and potassium that you would see. So you can see there the recommendation of 5, 10, 10. If we think of our fertilization talks, that would be 5% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and then 10% potassium. And so kind of a general recommendation is about 3 pounds of that per 100 square feet. That would be in the early spring before we have bloom for those spring flowering bulbs. So when you might see some foliage coming out, but before we have any of the flowers. Very similar for our summer flowering bulbs, same kind of fertilizer, but several times throughout the production time or the growing season, at 6-week intervals, about 2 pounds of that same kind of fertilizer. I generally don't recommend that people use fertilizer spikes on any sort of plant. I'm not picking on a particular brand here. That's just the image I happen to find most quickly. But fertilizer spikes do a really good job of delivering fertilizer right in the area around that spike. It's a lot easier to more evenly distribute a granular fertilizer than it is to use those stakes. So I would encourage you, first of all, I do think it's a good idea to have soil testing done on your landscape year to year, and to use a granular fertilizer or slow release fertilizer, because I just think it's easier to distribute that in a way that it's going to be a benefit to all the plants in your landscape. All right, so now we get to look at some nice pictures of some flowers. and talk about some of the flowers and bulbs that work really well here in Mississippi and in the surrounding area. Tulips are absolutely gorgeous. A wide range of different colors are available out there. Send up those really distinct flowers. And here in Mississippi, we do tend to plant them as annuals. We get the largest flowers off of them in that first spring after fall planting. And then the later flowers that we get are going to be a little bit smaller. Um, Tulips do tend to have a fairly large bulb. We want to put those about 5 to 8 inches deep. Again, that's 2.5 times as deep as the bulb is wide. And we want to plant them about 4 to 6 inches apart. They do fantastically in large groupings. They really just add a lot of color. If you plant them deep like that, you are going to get less multiplication. You're going to get that really nice large flowers. And then we want to dig, after we have the flowers go away and the foliage starts to die back, we want to dig up those bulbs and give them some cold storage. At least 6 to 8 weeks, in that 40 to 45 degree range before we plant them again into November and December. And we'll talk a little bit more about digging and storing bulbs as we get towards the end of the talk. Daffodils, another fantastic flower. Again, a lot of wonderful flower variation in this. I always think of the scientific name Narcissus and the Greek legend that goes along with that. Generally going to be planting these 3 to 6 inches. Again, that's going to be dependent on the size of the bulb. We will see a lot of variation in that. But space them about 6 to 8 inches apart. You can put them right out in the sun, leave them in the shade. They don't have to be dug up. You can leave them in the ground, or you can dig them out in late spring after their flowers have gone away and separate them out. If we're going to do that, again, we want to make sure the flowers are gone, that foliage has begun to yellow and wither. It's done all of that photosynthesis that it can do, collected all of that energy, made all of that sugar, and stored all of that in the bulb. That's going to be the sort of the fuel to start us off in the next season. Hyacinths really like the full sun. Generally planted 3 to 5 inches down and 3 to 6 inches apart. Really nice big clusters of flowers that they send up. Don't have to dig them. Certainly don't have to dig them every year in order to continue to get some really nice flowers out of them. But as they stay in the ground and as they multiply and kind of crowd each other, the flower size that you are going to get with these is going to decline. And if you really want to have those large flowers every year, you do need to dig them up and replace them in the fall. But it's perfectly okay to leave them for several years. And then every few years, you can kind of divide them and put back the bulbs that you need. And one of the great things I think about bulbs in general is that it's a great way to share plants with your neighbors and your friends and your other gardeners that you know, as you're getting just a massive number of a particular kind of flower. You can dig them up and divide them and share them out to the people who have commented on them in your landscape. Now, I did mention that we'd mentioned some things that were not true bulbs, and certainly irises are not. But a very, very popular kind of flower that does fantastically well. There are all sorts of different irises that we have, bearded irises and beardless and crested and bulb. Of course, the iris that I think of because of where I live is the Louisiana Iris that we have growing all over the place. There is a fantastic amount of variety in the sort of the structure of this plant. Some of them are quite short, Some of them put on quite small flowers, and some of them can grow up to be as tall as I am. Just kind of dependent on the variety that you have. They do have a rhizome that is very easy to dig up and to separate. Just make sure that you have some root and some shoot on each of those. Feel free to go back and look at the presentation where we talk specifically about division, because irises, just particularly if you have an area in your landscape that might be a little wet, irises really thrive in those conditions. We have some beautiful plantings of them here in Hancock County on one of our roadways as a demonstrated conservation planting. And they just do fantastic, really, with almost no effort to maintain them. Crocuses, generally a spring flowering Quorum, and we want to plant those in full sun in early fall. Plant them about 2 to 3 inches deep and about 2 to 6 inches apart. And then, every few years you can go back and separate those apart after that foliage begins to wither. That's kind of a unifying thing that, when we want to divide these is when that foliage is dying back, when it's no longer collecting energy that's being stored in this case, a quorum, or in some cases a bulb, some cases a rhizome. But again, just a really gorgeous flower that works really well in the landscape. Dahlias, again, just all sorts of variation. We can see here reds and yellows and variegated varieties, even oranges and blues. Just a fantastic amount of color, and I really love the structure of the dahlia flower. All of those internal petals just look really great. It is important. We do need to dig these up and store the fleshy roots each year. They don't tend to be particularly hardy, and they're a little bit of a special case. They're more like a tuber than most of the flowers that we deal with. But they do have an eye close to the root crown or to the center of the crown. You can, in a lot of cases, start these from seed, and they will perform fantastically well. If you are propagating the roots, make sure when you're dividing it up that you keep a portion of that old stem on there, because that will ensure that you get good bud development on your dahlias. Gladiolus, really interesting flowers, huge spikes of flowers with multiple blooms on them, really thrive in full sun. This is planted from a quorum, and generally, we can plant these at intervals, every 7 to 10 days, right up until about 2 months before we have that first frost. And then we'll just get kind of a succession of these gladioluses really throughout the year. One problem you can have with them is because they tend to grow very tall. They tend to get a lot of flowers on them. That can kind of weigh them down. Occasionally, they will kind of droop or lean on you. So it's a good idea, if you have small pieces of cane or small pieces of bamboo, you can stake the gladioluses. You can just kind of stick those pieces of cane down and actually tie the plant to it. That will make sure that you keep these erect and kind of standing upright in your landscape. When you're planting the quorum, again, that's really going to be dependent on the size of that quorum. We want to go back to our general guideline of 2.5 times as deep as the diameter of the bulb, or the quorum in this case. So anywhere from about 3 to 6 inches deep. But a great flower where you can again get a succession in different colors coming in, kind of to to fit the time that you're intending those flowers to show for you. Cannas, fortunately, we can just leave these in the ground in Mississippi throughout the year. planted from a rhizome that we put about 2 to 4 inches deep and about 12 to 18 inches apart. I know that they will survive and thrive here in Mississippi because I had one in kind of an ignored area of my landscape for a number of years, and it has continued. Once I discovered it, it has continued to send up flowers and bloom quite a lot. It really does enjoy full sun. And it's relatively easy to propagate by just digging up that rhizome, separating that out in the spring. There are one of the things I really like about Cannas is there's a lot of variation, not only in the flowers that you get, 'cause of course, I mean, you can get a lot of flower variation, reds and oranges, but there's also a lot of foliage variation that you can see with these, ranging from really nice greens into some variegated varieties with green and white and green and orange. And even as you see up in that top picture, some really deep reds or really dark colors that you can get in that foliage, which just gives you a little bit more options for what we can plant and the colors we can work with. Caladiums are interesting. I just got done planting, or not too long ago, got done planting some caladiums in my own landscape. Generally planted for their leaves more than anything else. Just an outstanding amount of variation in the colors, dark greens all the way to some really striking reds and dark colors. You can even find some varieties that are almost completely white. And there are different species. So some will tolerate full sun and really thrive in that environment. Some, particularly, some of the variegated varieties are going to be a lot happier in shade. We're going to put those tubers down when the temperature is about 70 degrees. Plant the top of that even with the soil, about 8 to 12 inches apart. In the fall, you can dig them up. Down here in South Mississippi, we wouldn't think of that. We just leave them in the ground, and they will divide all on their own and kind of fill in areas very well. But if you're in an area, if you're concerned about the cold, you can remove that foliage, let that tuber overwinter somewhere between 55 and 60 degrees. And you can hold that in storage over the winter. Now, a couple of things, about caladiums. If you want to wind up with one single large stem, you can remove all of the eyes except for one before planting. You can just use a good sharp, clean knife, or I've seen people using spoons for that as well. To remove those eyes, to prevent them coming up. That just allows all of that energy to go into that one large stem. So that will work very well. Okay, daylilies, really popular flower, all sorts of variation again, and certainly a lot of people that are interested in daylilies. So my apologies that I will not be giving them their just due in the next 30 seconds that I'm going to be talking about them. They are grown from tuberous roots. Usually we want to plant those about 1/2 to 1 inch deep and about 2 to 2.5 feet apart. There is a fantastic amount of variation, all sorts of different colors, all sorts of different growth habits that they have. And really we can get blooms throughout the summer, for a good solid month if we choose the right varieties. And we can leave those in the ground and just divide clumps of them about every 3 to 5 years to spread them out in the landscape. But I know there are whole daylily clubs and people really interested in the culture of these plants, and certainly in developing new varieties. So just a fascinating flower to have in the landscape. So I want to take some time to talk about digging and storing bulbs. Generally speaking, the spring flowering bulbs are going to be dug up from about late April into early May. Again, that is going to be dependent on where you are. Keep in mind, if you've got bulbs that are planted in the landscape, in and amongst permanent plantings, if you've got them, down at the base of a tree or at the base of shrubs, it may not be the best course to dig them up every year. And we may be able to just allow those to go dormant in the soil, because really no matter what we do, as we're digging those bulbs, we are going to be damaging the root system of the surrounding plants. And if we can get around disturbing those, then it really would be for the best. One thing that is useful, if we're going to be digging them, I would highly recommend doing that with a garden fork rather than using a shovel or a spade. As we insert that shovel or spade into the ground, we're very likely to, at the very least, damage the roots of the bulb, if not actually cut the bulbs themselves. So using a garden fork allows us to get in there and kind of lift them out without doing any damage to the plants or cutting into the bulbs. Once you pull them out of the ground, we want to knock away any loose soil, try to kind of brush that off or just knock it off. What we don't want to do is we don't want to wash them. We don't want to pour water over them. If they stay wet, that can promote rot. We want them to survive and thrive, to provide really good flowers for us again. Go ahead, remove any of the foliage, remove any of those roots, leaving behind just the bulb. And we don't want to immediately put them in a cold place. We want to put them in, in a nice cool place out of the sun for 2 to 3 days. Allow them to dry, just get that moisture off of them. When you lay them out so they can get some air circulation. Don't pile them up. Kind of put them out on a shelf or something where they're going to have some air movement over them, and separate them out wide enough that the air will be able to circulate around them to dry them off. Once we do that, we want to make sure it's time to put them in a refrigerator. If you live in an area where it's colder, some places suggest cold frames or things like that. For most of us in Mississippi, we really need to use a refrigerator to maintain the kinds of temperatures that we want to store these bulbs at. Generally 6 to 8 weeks in order to get the kind of flower development we're going to want in the next year. So another great thing about bulbs is that we can get them to flower kind of at a different time than they might otherwise. Forcing bulbs is just making that plant flower at a predetermined time by conditions that we impose on it. And hardy bulbs and other plants like this are really particularly suited to being forced and flowering when we want them to. So if we're going to be potting up bulbs, we want to do that anywhere from about September into December, kind of dependent on when we want the flowering date to be and the length of time that we're going to be storing them. So if we want flowering late December, if we want to give somebody some flowering plants for Christmas, we really want to get those in pots in mid-September. If we're looking at February, right in time for Valentine's Day, then right around October is where we want to put those plants down. And then right around November, if we're looking into that sort of March, April, sort of Easter season for producing those bulbs. And I always tend to think of that in terms of the holidays that we're looking at as ways to target when we're doing that, putting those bulbs down. All right, it is important to remember most hardy bulbs need to be exposed to cool temperatures between 35 and 50 degrees. That's just preparing them for leaf and flower growth. Generally speaking, they need a cooling period of somewhere between 12 and 16 weeks. If we don't cool a late flowering variety long enough, we are going to get short stems on that plant. It's going to just produce a very short stem. However, if we cool it too long, we wind up with really long stems. So aiming sort of right in the middle of that time period gives us just the amount of time that we need. So kind of saying the same thing here, just kind of emphasize this. We do need that period of time between 35 and 50 degrees, between 12 and 16 weeks. And some of the element here is that the length of time they require that period of cold is going to vary somewhat by the species of plant that we're dealing with. And so it's good to kind of, if you're digging them up and you're looking at doing this, it's good to look up some resources and kind of get an idea of how long those need to be stored under cool conditions. Once we're ready to get them going, take the pots out of storage, place them in a nice cool location where they're going to get indirect light. And we'll start to see the shoots coming up and turning green. Once those shoots start to get that green, starting to form chlorophyll, starting to get that process of creating energy going together, start exposing them to a warmer area and move them into more direct light, and that will stimulate their growth and flowering. It is a good idea when you have plants that particularly if we're trying to get them to flower. We want to rotate those pots fairly regularly, just to maybe do a quarter turn a day, just to make sure that those leaves get an equal amount of light. That way the plant doesn't lean on us. And generally speaking, we'll see buds within about 3 to 4 weeks when we do that. Once we start to see some color, we can move those pots right back into indirect sunlight, and moving them back into indirect sunlight will help prolong the flowers that we have. So if you do have these bulbs, you have forced them into flowering, you can still plant them out in the garden once spring gets around, or you can just allow them to go fully mature and go dormant in the pots, and then you can go ahead and plant them out in the fall. All right, so that is my commentary on bulbs. Appreciate any questions. Always love to hear from people, and I apologize for calling.